March 14th, 1954, 11:47 p.m., Harlem, New York. The back room of a barber shop on 125th Street held the stillness of a confession booth. Bay rum hung in the air, sharp and medicinal, mixing with the metallic bite of a radiator that had stopped working hours ago. The barber chairs sat empty, their leather cracked and cold. The mirrors reflected nothing but shadows and the faint amber glow of a single lamp. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson sat alone at a card table pushed against the far wall. A cup of coffee rested beside his right hand, untouched, a skin of cold forming across its surface. His overcoat hung from a nail by the back door, not the front. His hat waited on the chair across from him, positioned as though saving a seat for a man who would never arrive. He had not moved in 43 minutes. Outside, the sound of a patrol car crawled down the block. Its headlights swept across the frosted window, slow and deliberate, then continued past. The engine faded into the March night. Bumpy did not turn his head. His eyes remained fixed on the door. He already knew what was being prepared for him. He had known for 6 days, since a porter at the Hotel Theresa had passed him a folded napkin containing 3 words and a date. Since a clerk at the 28th Precinct had made a telephone call to a number that rang in a shoe repair shop on Lenox Avenue. Since a paragraph appeared in the Amsterdam News, buried on page 3 beneath a story about a Baptist choir competition. A major figure in Harlem's underworld will be taken into custody before month's end, the paper had quoted an anonymous police source. The arrest is imminent. The city will see that no one is beyond the law. Bumpy had read the paragraph twice. Then he had folded the newspaper with the care of a man folding a letter he intended to keep and set it aside without comment. Now he waited. Not because he feared what was coming. Fear had been burned out of him decades ago, in places and circumstances that left no room for it. He waited because he understood something the detectives at the 28th Precinct did not. An arrest is not simply an act. It is a performance staged for an audience that extends far beyond the room where handcuffs close around a man's wrists. The police believed they were planning a demonstration of power, a public reminder of who held authority in this city, on these streets, over these people. They were wrong. They were planning a demonstration, but the lesson it would teach was not the one they intended. Somewhere across Harlem, in a precinct with a smell of cigarette smoke and old paper, warrants were being signed with ceremonial gravity. Detectives were reviewing logistics, selecting the location, timing the approach for maximum visibility. A photographer had been contacted. A quote had been prepared for the morning edition. They believed they were setting a trap. Bumpy Johnson remained motionless at the card table, his breathing steady, his hands still. What the 28th Precinct did not yet understand, what they would not understand until it was far too late, was that the trap had already been set, just not by them. But what unfolded over the next 72 hours would become one of the most quietly devastating displays of power Harlem had ever witnessed. Not through violence, not through confrontation, but through something far more dangerous. A single moment in a hotel lobby that would humiliate the police department, protect an empire, and prove why Bumpy Johnson was untouchable in ways that badges and warrants could never reach. To understand how he did it, you need to see exactly what happened when those detectives walked through that door. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. To understand what happened that week, one must first understand what Harlem had become by 1954 and what Bumpy Johnson meant to the people who lived there. The neighborhood had changed. The jazz clubs still played, but the crowds were thinner. The numbers runners still worked the corners, but their routes had been compressed, squeezed between competing interests. Downtown syndicates had begun to eye Harlem not as territory to respect, but as territory to absorb. And the police, long accustomed to a certain arrangement, had grown impatient. For years, a quiet equilibrium had held. Payments moved through intermediaries. Raids occurred on schedule, always targeting the expendable. Arrests were made when necessary, always against men who understood the terms. It was theater, and everyone knew their lines. But by early 1954, pressure had come from Albany. Reform candidates were circling. A new district attorney had made public statements about cleaning up the boroughs. The 28th Precinct needed a headline, and there was only one name that would satisfy the papers. According to historical accounts, Bumpy Johnson had been aware of the shifting winds for months. His network of informants, porters, doormen, waiters, clerks had reported unusual activity. Detectives who rarely ventured above 110th Street had been seen asking questions. A federal agent had visited a known associate under the pretense of a tax inquiry. Bumpy said nothing publicly. He changed nothing in his routine. But those who knew him noticed small adjustments. He began taking his evening meals at different restaurants, never announcing his destination in advance. He dismissed his driver for 2 weeks, choosing instead to walk. It is believed that during this period he also sent quiet messages to certain figures in the community: ministers, shop owners, a retired judge. The content of these messages was never recorded, but their effect would become clear. The trap the police were setting had already been inverted. They simply did not know it yet. March 17, 1954, 6:15 p.m., the Hotel Theresa, Harlem. The lobby of the Hotel Theresa was quieter than usual. A bellhop stood near the elevators, polishing a brass rail that did not need polishing. 2 women in fur stoles whispered near the front desk, their eyes flicking toward the entrance every few seconds. Detective Harold Vaughn of the 28th Precinct stood just inside the revolving door, his overcoat unbuttoned despite the cold. Beside him, 2 uniformed officers waited with studied indifference. Vaughn had been given clear instructions. The arrest was to be clean, public, and documented. A photographer from the Daily News was already positioned across the street, waiting for the signal. The plan was simple. Bumpy Johnson was known to dine at the hotel's restaurant on Wednesday evenings. The detectives would enter, approach his table, and make the arrest in full view of the other patrons. The charge was minor, a parole technicality, easily defensible, but the image would be powerful. The city would see that no one was untouchable. Vaughn checked his watch. 6:18. The restaurant was visible through a set of glass doors, white tablecloths, low chandeliers, a pianist playing something soft and forgettable. Bumpy Johnson's usual table, third from the window facing the entrance, was empty. Vaughn frowned. He turned to the desk clerk, a thin man with round spectacles and an expression of practiced neutrality. "Mr. Johnson," Vaughn said, "is he expected this evening?" The clerk adjusted his glasses. "I'm afraid I couldn't say, sir." "You couldn't say, or you won't say?" The clerk smiled politely. "I believe that's the same question, sir." Before Vaughn could respond, the revolving door turned behind him. Bumpy Johnson stepped into the lobby. He wore a charcoal gray suit, single-breasted, with a white pocket square folded into a precise square. His overcoat was draped over one arm. His hat, a black Homburg, sat perfectly level on his head. He did not look at the detectives. He walked past them, nodding once to the bellhop, and continued toward the elevator. The lobby fell silent. Vaughn stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson." Bumpy stopped. He turned slowly, his expression calm, almost curious. "Detective," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "I didn't realize the hotel had changed its dress code." One of the uniformed officers shifted his weight. The other looked at Vaughn for guidance. Vaughn held up a folded document. "We have a warrant for your arrest, parole violation. You'll need to come with us." Bumpy glanced at the paper, but did not reach for it. "I see," he said. He looked past Vaughn, toward the glass doors of the restaurant. Several diners had turned in their seats. A woman in pearls covered her mouth with her napkin. Bumpy returned his gaze to the detective. "You've chosen a fine evening for it. May I ask, is there a photographer outside?" Vaughn hesitated. Bumpy nodded slowly, as though the silence had answered him. "I thought so." He handed his overcoat to the bellhop, who accepted it without a word. Then he adjusted his cuffs, one at a time, and took a single step toward the door. And then he stopped. What happened next would be described differently by every witness present, but certain details remained consistent across all accounts. Bumpy Johnson did not resist. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any gesture that could be interpreted as defiance. Instead, he turned to face the restaurant, and he waited. Within 30 seconds, the first diner rose from his table, a man in his 60s, silver-haired, wearing a pinstriped suit. He walked to the glass doors, pushed them open, and stepped into the lobby. He stood beside Bumpy without speaking. Then another rose, a woman this time, tall and elegant, her gloves still in her hand. She joined the first man, her expression composed. Then another. Then another. Within 2 minutes, more than a dozen patrons had left their tables and gathered in the lobby, forming a loose semicircle around Bumpy Johnson and the detectives. No one spoke. Vaughn looked at his officers. Their confidence had visibly eroded. "This isn't necessary," Vaughn said, his voice tight. "We're simply executing a warrant." A man near the back of the group, a minister recognizable by his collar, stepped forward. "Detective," he said, "I believe you'll find that Mr. Johnson has already arranged to surrender himself tomorrow morning at the precinct. His attorney confirmed the appointment this afternoon." Vaughn blinked. "That's not—" "It's in writing," the minister continued, "delivered to your captain's office at 4 o'clock. I witnessed the delivery myself." Silence. Bumpy had not moved. His hands remained at his sides. His expression had not changed. But something in the room had shifted. The detectives were no longer in control of the moment. The arrest, designed to be a public display of authority, had become something else entirely. A test. And the police were failing it. Vaughn looked at the crowd. He looked at Bumpy. He looked at the photographer's shadow still visible through the glass door. He folded the warrant and placed it back in his coat. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Bumpy inclined his head. "I wouldn't miss it." The detectives turned and walked out through the revolving door. The uniformed officers followed without looking back. The lobby remained still for a long moment. Then, one by one, the diners returned to their tables. The pianist resumed playing. The bellboy returned Bumpy's coat. Bumpy Johnson stood alone in the center of the lobby, adjusting his hat. He had not said more than 50 words. He had not needed to. The following morning, at precisely 8:55 a.m., Bumpy Johnson arrived at the 28th Precinct on West 123rd Street. He was accompanied by his attorney, a former assistant district attorney named Leonard Whitmore, and by 3 witnesses: the minister from the hotel, a local business owner, and a retired city councilman. The arrest was processed quietly. No photographers were present. No statements were made to the press. The charge, a parole technicality involving a failure to report a change of address, was dismissed within 72 hours. A clerical error, the court noted. The original paperwork had been filed correctly. Detective Vaughn was reassigned to a precinct in Queens 2 weeks later. No explanation was given. The Amsterdam News did not cover the arrest, nor did the Daily News. The promised headline never materialized. But in Harlem, the story spread. Not through newspapers, through conversations, through glances exchanged in barbershops and church basements and after-hours clubs, through the quiet nods of men who understood what had happened without needing it explained. The police had promised an arrest, and Bumpy Johnson had given them one, on his terms, in his time, with his audience watching. The message was not subtle. It did not need to be. Power in Harlem was not measured by who could make threats. It was measured by who could control the moment when those threats arrived. In the weeks that followed, historians later noted a series of small but significant changes in the neighborhood. Certain business owners who had considered relocating chose to stay. A minister who had been pressured to cooperate with a federal investigation quietly declined further meetings. A numbers operation that had been targeted for shutdown continued without interruption. No violence occurred, no public confrontations took place, but the equilibrium had been restored. According to those who knew him, Bumpy Johnson never spoke of the incident at the Hotel Theresa. When asked years later, he would simply change the subject, offering a faint smile that revealed nothing. But the legend persisted. In some versions, the crowd in the lobby numbered 50. In others, the detectives had drawn their weapons and been talked down by a single word. In still others, the minister had delivered a sermon on the precinct steps while Bumpy watched from a passing car. None of these versions were accurate, but all of them contained the same truth. The police had come to Harlem expecting a performance. Bumpy Johnson had given them one, just not the one they had planned. What followed became legend, remembered differently depending on who was watching.